All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And a very warm welcome from Chicago, all the way from Chicago, Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff. Without sharing a whole bio, I know Zev we share an alma mater. We both went to REITs. I know Zev at one point edited The Commentator, the student newspaper. I was an avid reader of. Zev's name went before him both in yeshiva and now throughout the Jewish world through your books and your writings, your essays, both in Jewish history and more Jewish sociology, and commenting on Jewish community today and its trends. It's a really honor to have you join us here in London, here at the Shomrei community, and we're looking forward to this talk. So, without further ado, over to you, Zev.
Thank you, Rabbi Segal. This is great. If you could allow me to share my screen.
Sure.
And thank you so much. This is I guess I haven't been back to England in probably 10 years. I got in trouble the first time that I first came. I was staying with cousins in Golders Green, and I was on a research trip. I was working on my dissertation. I was going to look at Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler's papers. And in preparation, I read all of the major books on British Jewry. I mean, there isn't so many, but they're very good. I mean, it's a substantial history, but you could read it in a couple of months, is what I suggest. And so I read it, and I was writing my dissertation. I was very much at home in the 19th century, not in the 20th or in that time, the 21st. So I got into a bit of a rage with my cousins because I desperately wanted to visit the Great Synagogue in London. I thought they were playing a trick on me. They said, there is no such place. I said, there has to be. I know it. It's the seat of the chief rabbinate. Everybody knows that. And this was a Friday night dinner over chicken soup. I thought they were playing some hoax on me, that there wasn't any. Then I remembered that unfortunately it was destroyed in World War II. It was blitzkrieg. And it's a good reminder that it's not always the safest thing to be stuck in an earlier century. One has to be mindful of both, and hopefully talking about sports, and particularly basketball and the yarmulke and dress wear, hopefully it resonates better than when I studied 19th century British Judaism. I'm going to share my screen. Let's start. And so our business today, I'm glad you're recording, yarmulke politics, basketball, and Jewish identity in America. And I'm going to make an argument that there's significant overlap, both in the history of the yarmulke, unquestionably, in Anglo-speaking communities, America and in England. And so although our case study happens to be not for the institution that I work for, it happens to be the Hebrew Theological College, but its message and its messaging has significant import for Jewish identity, both in the United States, England, and really elsewhere. First, a bit about the yarmulke. Here's a picture of the Jewish People's Institute, sort of like the Y, or the JCC, the Jewish Community Center here in Chicago, like an enormous building, no longer in existence actually, on the west side of Chicago. And a rabbinical student at the time, Leonard Mishkin, he sat for an oral history in the 1970s and recalling the 1920s. This was the situation about yarmulke, about kippot. In the university, they didn't wear kippot. Talking about the University of Chicago. In those days, nobody dared to put on a kippah. The only time we put on a kippah in the university in those days was when we had our lunches. Draw. You make a bracha. Where a man wears a yarmulke. Yarmulkes were not much in fashion at all. And in fact, here's an article from the Orthodox Union Jewish Life in 1953 with an article, why wear a yarmulke? You don't ask such a question. if everybody's wearing one in the 1950s. And here is actually a YU Rosh Hashiva who passed away quite recently. Rabbi Joseph Weiss was a Shiur assistant for Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik. And if you look at the middle, I apologize if it's too small to read on your computer. If you take a look at the second column with the subheading above the head of man, this then brings us to the meaning of the yarmulke. Just as with clothing, which man devised to cover his body as an expression of the weakness of his physical being, so too the Jewish genius, the Yiddish cup, I suppose, saw fit to cover the head to express realization of the shortcomings of man's intellect. Unguided and uninstructed by the higher power, the brain too is a source of evil and shame and distrust of the human intelligence. The uncontrolled mind can design the greatest evils. Now remember, 1953 is the height of communism. Is the greatest evils and can bring the greatest calamities upon the world. World events of the last few generations, here he obviously has the Shoah in mind, but certainly communism is much a part of this, form strong evidence in support of this statement. To the Jew, bareheadedness symbolizes unguided free thinking, which can bring harm and ruin individually and collectively. And so it's an interesting argument about wearing a yarmulke. If you want to be thinking narrowly, sharply, focused, a man wears a yarmulke. I don't know what he says, if maybe women aren't free thinkers at all. Maybe that's why they don't have to wear a yarmulke, perhaps. I don't know. He doesn't address it in the article. And here, Eric Silverman, who wrote a very good book on a cultural history of Jewish dress, points out that actually the situation in the United States and England were exactly the same. That if you take a look at pictures, men, we're talking about men in particular for this case, would be out in public, usually, really into the 1960s, not bareheaded at all, but wearing a hat on their head. But inside, they wouldn't be photographed with yarmulkes on their head, with kippot. And I'll use the terms yarmulke, kippah interchangeably, but of course, yarmulke is a German, Yiddish, English extrapolation. It becomes a kippah with Zionism, of course, the kippot. It transitions to a Hebrew term, which is interesting in its own right. So I want to say that aloud, although for our purposes, I'm not going to be looking at that too deeply. So what is it? Let's just get to the halacha on the books. So if you take a look at Shulchan Aruch, at the very, very beginning of Rabbi Yosef Kairo's 16th century tome, Asur, Leilech Bekoma Zakufa, you shouldn't walk too far upright. You shouldn't have too good a posture. I always took solace in this particular sif in Shulchan Aruch. V'lo Yeilech Dalad Amot Begilei Rosh, and you should not walk 4 cubits, 6 to 8 feet. If you're a man, bareheaded. So that's the position of the Machaber, of the author of the Shulchan Aruch. The Darkei Moshe, the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, writing around the same time, he writes the following in that second source below, and I've given you both in Hebrew and in English. The Katav HaKolba, B'Shem Haram, De'enu Asar L'Lech B'Gilei Rosh. Actually, I disagree. And a whole litany of Ashkenazic sources disagree as well. Zaya midat chasidut. It's a good thing, don't get me wrong, says the Rama, who likely wore a yarmulke in public. It's a midat chasidut. It's a good thing to do. But it's not on the books, not official. Harav Rabbeinu Peretz, Katav, one of the leading Balei Tosfot, Sha'asar Leilech B'Gilei Rosh L'Beit HaKnesset, that really, you have to wear it, certainly in a synagogue during prayers. Biskei Hamari, in the Trumas Hadeshen, Simon Reish Gimel Katav, Amash Sha'altem, Shiltonim, Gazra al Yehudim, and writing about an interesting question, actually, and this is a major question in the 18th century about swearing under oath. And famously, the Rothschilds didn't hold any official position in Parliament because for many generations they refused to swear on a Bible. But the question of the Gilei Rosh or not, can you make a swear, an oath, with your bareheaded? But bottom line is that the Maharil and others suggest that it's mandatory, but by and large, contrary to the Shulchan Aruch, the position was that on the books, when you're not when you're not experiencing what we might call a religious moment, where you're not reciting a benediction, a blessing over food, or reciting prayers, or in the midst of learning, you don't need al-pi-din. I'm not saying it's advisable, but al-pi-din, you don't need to wear a yarmulke. That's real. So let's put that in our parking lot for a little bit, because that's going to come up in our story. This is also pretty small. Anybody know who any of these figures are? No? So on the bottom left is for those of us who are into the culture of sculpture artists, that's Brenda Putnam, who was in her time in the mid-20th century, was a marvelous sculptor. Her father actually was the head of the Smithsonian for many years. And in the late 1940s, the US Capitol, so in Washington, D.C., its air conditioning countdown broke. And in those times, the machinery was quite clunky. And so replacing your HVAC was no simple thing, especially when you're talking about the capital of the United States. So because it was going to be quite an invasive procedure to replace the air conditioning unit, the architect of the Capitol, that's an official office, the architect of the Capitol, decided to petition for funds to remodel the entire house, well, the House chamber in our case. And if you if you search what the House chamber looks like, you'll see that there are 22 portraits of lawgivers. And it's an interesting history of who got in and who didn't. Mohammed's in, the founder of Christianity is not. Was considered to be a theological leader, but not a lawgiver. And 2 Jews made the cut of famous lawgivers. Who were they? They were 2 Moses. Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moses Maimonides. As you can imagine, Cicero made the cut, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. So 2 Moseses made the cut. And Brenda Putnam won her bid to sculpt 3 different portraits. So 3 out of the 22. And one of them was Maimonides, and that on the top left is her rendering of Moses Maimonides in a turban. And as you can see, and I wish it were a little bit, if you could strain your eyes just a little bit on the right side, here's a correspondence. We don't have the first one, the first set, but in her archives at Syracuse University, here is a letter from Brenda Putnam to one of the leading Talmudists, at the time, in the United States, was Saul Lieberman, the rector of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who you can see in the middle picture, wore a very large yarmulke. And this is in the 1950s. And she begins writing at this time, January 24th, 1950, "It has been so long since you so kindly helped me last September." So already they've had a correspondence, had these 2 in their own fields, very prominent figures. And she's returning to her correspondence with the great scholar of Judaism. And if you take a look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th, the bulkiest of the paragraphs, that she announces that now that she's finished her sculpture of Salome, she wants to begin her portrait of Maimonides. "I should so very much like to give him one." Oh, if you take a look, she says in the 4th column, so it says, "Having just finished Salome, I have now begun Maimonides, and am wondering if you are still as firm as ever in your conviction that if the turban is abandoned," you can see she ended up with the turban, "he should not wear any sort of head covering or small cap, such as you and your colleagues wear." So she was under the understanding, Brenda Putnam was not a Jew, that rabbis already in mid-century tended to wear yarmulkes on their heads. And she wanted not to put a turban. I don't know if this was anti-Islamicism going on. She doesn't explain it. Certainly has no history of it. But she wanted to put some head covering on the Rambam. "I should so very much like to give him one," a cap, that is, "even though such things were prescribed long after the 12th century. Rambam lived from 1138 to 1204. Aside from great Hebrew scholars in the group, aside from Moses, excuse me, Maimonides is the only great Hebrew scholar in the group, and I should like to add this small, recognizable image. Not only because it adds distinction and a decorative line to the design. So from an artistic point of view, scaffolding the top of his head made good sense from the artistic point of view. So not only because of that, but because it would make him say readily identifiable, to the thousands of visitors in the galleries. So she wants to know, dear Rabbi Lieberman, are you still sure? Now, history, I can assure you, doesn't change. If you're living in the 20th century, your opinion of the 12th century doesn't much change 4 months later. Whatever happened, happened. So, but she isn't pleading. Can you give me a heter, Rabbi? Permission to give him a yarmulke, even though it's anachronistic, even though it's likely the Rambam never wore a yarmulke, never got engaged in the politics of a suede yarmulke, a velvet yarmulke, a knitted crochet kippah guy, never knew from any such things. But I would like to give him number one, from the artistic point of view. It makes sense. It captures the shape of the head, she claims, but also because I'm noticing that people are starting to wear yarmulkes among your faith community, among Jews, already in the 1950s. And because there are only 2 Jews, when people and visitors are in the house chamber, I want them to know that my sculpture is one of a Jew. It was curious. We presumably Lieberman said, no, my view has not changed. And so she went with the turban to be historically accurate. By 1967, things had changed for the yarmulke. Why? Not because people were becoming necessarily more stringent, more machmir. That there was a collective decision to follow the stringent position of the Machaber, of the Shulchan Aruch, rather than the Ramah, per se. But the kippah, more than anything else, perhaps, in Jewish dress wear, was co-signed to a Jewish identity. In the wake of the Six-Day War, there was nothing cooler than being a Jew. And here, I've made this a habit, unfortunately, the last couple of weeks of referring to the late Rabbi Norman Lamb, a master teacher, leader. It's still choking to refer to him as no longer among us. And in his archives, which, there are thousands of people have accessed the Lamb archives at Yeshiva University, and they're a tremendous resource for historians. But I can assure you, there aren't thousands of scholars of American Orthodoxy. It turns out that many rabbis are using Rabbi Lamb's drushot, his sermons, in their own writings and in their own speeches. So Rabbi Lamb lives on in the rabbinic mind and the rabbinic sermon. And anyway, in 1971, Rabbi Lamb, and it's June time, so it's that June 67 was the Six-Day War, so it's 4 years after, almost to the day of the Six-Day War. And he's delivering a sermon about Jewish identity. Strictly speaking, I'm on the top left. Now I see the words are more visible to everybody. So strictly speaking, the law is quite lenient in this respect about wearing a yarmulke, that you don't need to. We've reviewed some of the sources. What is important is the kippah as a psycho-cultural symbol. In my generation, even the most pious did not wear the kippah in museums or libraries. We've already reviewed some of those sources, in theaters or universities or public places. And we impose our standards upon our children. We do not relish the kippah as a sign of our differentness. We want to avoid the sneer on on that larger section over here, or the smirk of the socially superior American. We do not want to stand out too much. We want to keep our religion, our practices in our homes and not make it too blatant and too demonstrative. We want to fit in, and the kippah demonstratively makes us not fit in. Again, for men, I'm aware. But this is the very reason that today's youth, not necessarily for religious reasons at all, insist upon wearing the kippah every place. Places public and private, streets or home, museum or library or movies or wherever it might be. They are saying, this is my identity, my Jewish identity, whether you like it or not. I am who I am, and I shall not be someone else in order to please you. The kippah represents to me what I am. Let me just move. In my eyes. In my eyes. I could not care less what it means to you in your eyes. So there is this flouting of what other people think. I have a distinct Jewish identity, an undaunted sense of Jewish identity. I will respect you. I will be considerate of you. I will help you. But I will not modify my being to change my character and curb my own identity in order to satisfy standards that you think proper, but which I reject. In fact, Erik Erikson, the great psychologist, was the person who introduced identity into general discourse everywhere. It wasn't just in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where Rabbi Lamb was delivering a sermon at the Jewish Center. Identity was much in vogue. Where do I exist? Where is my community? Where am I? That was the sense of 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s about Jewish identity. And the yarmulke for men very much was assigned value because Jews felt, you know what, especially after the Six-Day War, where Zionism and having a homeland and pride of Jewish military victory, unprecedented, an underdog victory, no less. All of that, Jews were awash in triumphalism. Orthodox Jews in particular were. And this new generation, young people, they say that the trick about getting people to recycle wasn't convincing the parents, but the young people. So similarly with identity, it wasn't about the older people, but the young people brought Jewish identity to the table. And for our case, for the yarmulke as well. And it's not a halachic issue. It's not even a religious issue so much. It's a cultural identity community idea of wearing a yarmulke. And by the late 1970s, the Jewish press, I could have given you another article in the Wall Street Journal, but here in the Philadelphia Jewish Exponent, trying to take us all around the country. The yarmulke, here to stay, but always changing. People are entranced by the symbolism of the yarmulke. And that brings us to 1981.
Eleff, can I just ask a quick question?
Please.
Are we backfilling the process as to how people started wearing yarmulkes and trying to give it a philosophical explanation? It almost feels by Norman Lamb that it was a conscious decision. I just didn't really get that feeling that it was a conscious decision. It feels like something that evolved over time, almost like we've evolved from not wearing hats in the streets, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, from wearing to not wearing. Is it really that conscious a decision?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So he's writing 4 years out. I think it's a mixture, certainly, and I wouldn't say backfilling though. I would say is that what people started to wear their it could have been as easily as simple as, you went to synagogue, and whereas in the 50s you remove your yarmulke and you put it into your back pocket, all of a sudden people started not to do that. They wondered unconsciously to themselves, why did they do that? And maybe others did consciously. But when they thought about it, what was it about distinctive dress? And then I think the other part of it was to emulate Israelis. Israelis had already started wearing yarmulkes in public, and they are the majority, of course. Much before, already in the birth of the state of Israel in 1948. And so to emulate Israelis, and Zionists and others started wearing their tzitzit, outside of, like the Magen Avraham suggests, but that was not the position in Lithuania. Part of it is for the mystical purposes of wearing your kippah outside of your pants. But also that's not tucked in. But others to have an identity. And it's not just Jews in their space. Remember that with the the entire world is becoming more religious in the 1950s. In order to be anti-communist. Communists were the atheists. They were the ones who rebelled against God. So Jews, everybody, and the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, before them were the anti-religious people. And so that's why, for example, when famously the four chaplains, there was a German submarine destroyed an American vessel, and there weren't enough life vests for everybody. So the four chaplains, 2 Protestants, 1 Jew, 1 rabbi, and 1 Catholic priest, gave up their life vests. Well, the rabbi said Shema Yisrael. The others said their last wills, and they died. They went down with the ship. It becomes a movie, and this idea of Judeo-Christian values, what exactly that means is not our business here, but the term evokes a certain level of religiousness, of religious consciousness that exists in the 1950s, and it's everywhere that's trying to combat Nazism and then communism. And so everybody is trying to wear their religion. So the same way you have Christians wearing crosses as necklaces. And those of them who buried it underneath their shirt all of a sudden wore it much more exposed for that reason. So everybody is wearing their religion on their sleeves or any type of garment, any type of attire they could. So it was all a part of that. But I agree with you. It wasn't as deliberate. It wasn't as if there was a synod, a Sanhedrin, or some meeting that said we're going to wear yarmulkes now. And I think that when they thought about it, it had a lot to do with just, clothing is an identifier. I'm very conscious that I used to basically sleep in a suit. But since March, I have worn a suit very seldom. And even I thought to myself, for a particular, is this a shiur or is this a lecture that I'm being asked to give in London? If it's a shiur, maybe I should wear a suit and tie, at least from the waist up. If I'm talking about basketball, perhaps I could do business casual.
Well, the answer for us, you can do whatever you like.
So that's what I figured.
Thank you very much. It's a good answer to my question. Much appreciated.
Sure.
I didn't mean to interrupt the flow, jeez.
No, not at all. It's good. It's good to have a conversation. So it brings us to 1981 and sport. Sport is a curious thing. On one hand, it is totally inconsequential. On the other hand, Franklin Shiur wrote a very provocative book called How Soccer Explains the World. It's interesting is that it's called How Soccer Explains the World and not How Football Explains the World, even though he's really writing about Europe and geopolitics. But people in your neck of the woods kill each other over football. If I'm giving the shiur in London, I have to use your term, football. They beat each other up. Their wedding colors look like, Manchester United or whatever it is. They are absorbed in their sport. They are terribly miserable when their team loses. When they win, they're absolutely elated. But actually, the tradition of sport really begins in the modern tradition, that is, begins in Victorian England in the 19th century with rowing, particularly among college athletes at Oxford and Cambridge. And in that tradition, everything was quite pleasant. These were men's schools, and sports were promoted for really everybody had to find their sport. And many of the English public schools, and those are really private schools, in those times, it was mandatory. Everybody had to pick their own sport in Victorian England. And not because you had to win or had to be good, but you had to develop character. you had to develop gentlemanly sensibilities. It wasn't about winning. In fact, a lot of the reports of different matches between Cambridge and Oxford neglected to mention whether it was football, if it was track, if it was rowing, neglected to mention who won the bout. What was much more important was who participated, because sport was a way about cultivating how to be a gentleman. Now, who ruined it? The Americans, and particularly Yale College. So Harvard is really the first to bring collegiate sport. Harvard's usually the first. They can afford it. To the United States. Yale is the one who decides that the purpose of sport is to win. Now, both strands, both values, one having to do with competition, but the other with formulating values, sportsmanship, masculinity, all those things are bound up with playing sport, whether you're good or not, whether you win or lose. Those are two parts of sports. The seedier, of course, is the competitive side, and I blame Yale, as do most scholars of American sport. And you see both come out in 2 yearbooks of Jewish day schools in Chicago in 1981. I know it's small, so for this I blew them up. Let me just move the Zoom tools aside. Ida Crown Jewish Academy reports the senior varsity started out this year with many high expectations, but unfortunately their playing didn't fulfill its potential. They didn't win that much, says the Academy. The season started out well with a preseason tournament victory over, I apologize. This is the Skokie Yeshiva. This is my school, the Fasman Yeshiva High School. They were supposed to be good. They beat the Academy, Ida Crown. So this is the men's school, the Yeshiva, we'll call it. It's how they pronounce it in Chicago, Yeshiva. It's Yeshiva University, but this is the Skokie Yeshiva. The season, I'm contractually obligated to call it Yeshiva. The season started out well with a preseason tournament victory. Over the Academy with an away victory over St. Vincent's. Senior captains Howie Singer and Shalom Menorah played an important role in helping the team mature, and both captains played experienced ball on the court. With the return of the outstanding juniors to the squad next year, the team should have much success. What was important to the Skokie Yeshiva was winning. They didn't do much of it in 1981, but they did for the very first time, I believe, since the team was formed in eight years prior, was they beat their rival, the Academy. I see there's a question. Shalom Menorah was in my year at KBY. Wonderful. I'll pass along your salutations if you'd like. He's also my neighbor. Wonderful, wonderful person. And his name is going to figure in very prominently in the next slides. Thank you for pointing that out. So that's the Yeshiva's take on the season in 1981. The Academy, who, for the first time suffered a defeat against its rival Yeshiva, they didn't focus so much on the wins and losses, but the character building. One big season highlight was the Illinois High School Association's regional basketball tournament, when our varsity team almost did not play due to the fact that they wear kippot, strange spelling. Rabbi Tzvi Blanchard, the principal, along with some top people from the yeshiva, took the IHSA, that's Illinois High School Association, to court and received a temporary restraining order on the association's limitation. The association claimed that the kippah could fall to the floor and cause a player to slip, or a bobby pin could stick someone in the eye. This alleged rule was never enforced by a referee during any previous season, though, and never has a kippah been the cause of a player's injury. In the end, the teams lost the battles on the court, but won their war in the court. A good pun. And if anything were learned from the whole case, it was that we stood up for what we believed in and showed that it was necessary to make a separation between a secular activity and a religious belief. Anybody ever slip on a yarmulke while playing ball? No. So what happened? On or about, and this is from the legal documents from the American Jewish Historical Society. And here you see our pictures of, you guessed it, the Academy Yeshiva playing ball with kippahs on. And you can see that they won the Yeshiva, so they're taking their coach, Sheldon Schaffel, excuse me, his son is Gershon Schaffel, Rabbi Gershon Schaffel. They're hoisting him up because they've had their first victory over the Academy. On or about February 5th, 1981, HTC coach, so that's the Yeshiva is the Hebrew Theological College, Sheldon Schaffel, heard a rumor that 3 years ago, the wearing of yarmulkes was challenged at the state regional tournament held in Harvard, Illinois. And this is the very first time the Yeshiva would be playing in the playoff. First time they'd have a postseason. Coach Schaffel then contacted the Harvard, it's not Harvard College in Boston, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but Harvard in Illinois, basketball coach and tournament manager of the Harvard Regional, who told Coach Schaffel that he did not object to the HTC Yeshiva team wearing yarmulkes. So the opposition, much better team it turned out, said, no problem, wear a yarmulke. But that HTC Yeshiva should contact the Illinois High School Association. HTC Yeshiva contacted IHSA, first by telephone and then by a letter dated February 12th, so about a week later, exactly a week later, 1981, requesting clarification of the yarmulke issue. Defendant, so this is the Yeshiva and the Academy suing for the right to wear yarmulkes. The defendant, Illinois High School Association, responded in a letter dated February 18th, so 6 days later, and received by HTC Yeshiva on Friday, February 20th, 1981, stating that students will not be allowed to participate in the regional tournament wearing yarmulkes, the reason being safety. And here are the two letters from the Yeshiva administrator, Rabbi Jerry Eisenberg, and Don Robinson of Illinois High School Association. Here are the letters, February 12th and February 18th. Now, what is the new rule book furnished for that year, for 1980-1981? The referee shall not permit any player to wear equipment which, in his or her judgment, on the right, you see this is what Illinois looks like, is dangerous to other players. Elbow, hand, finger, wrist, or forearm guard, cast or brace made of hard or unyielding leather, plaster, pliable, soft plastic, metal, or any other hard substance, very Talmudic, even though covered with soft padding, shall always be declared illegal. So if it's hard, if it hurts, illegal. Head decorations, headwear, or jewelry are illegal. Barrettes made of soft metal are legal. And I then bold saying, because that was the contested term. Is a kippah like a barrette? Headbands no wider than 2 inches, made of non-abrasive, unadorned, single cloth, color cloth, fiber, soft leather, pliable, plastic, or rubber are legal. So is a yarmulke a barrette or not? Essentially, it was the decision. So in the Chicago Sun-Times, this made the news. 5 players from the Yeshiva High School of the Theological College in Skokie, kind of mangled the name a little, and the Ida Crown Academy in Chicago brought a lawsuit challenging an IHSA rule banning the wearing of headgear during basketball games. U.S. District Judge Milton I. Shader, you guessed it, a Jew, agreed Monday to issue a restraining order following a short hearing and ordered attorneys for both sides to return to court Wednesday if both teams have won their Class A regional contest and move into the finals. So you can see is the Jewish federal judge said, I am going to allow them to wear yarmulkes during this game, and the lead among the students was the Yeshiva captain, Shalom Menorah and Roy Alswing for the Academy. Yeshiva Academy, we'll use those terms. And Judge Shader said, we will take up the issue should your teams continue in the playoff. However, Yeshiva was blown out by host Harvard 99-54 Monday night. Ida Crown is scheduled to play at St. Gregory on Tuesday. They didn't fare much better. Both teams, therefore, were ousted. It didn't matter where they were a yarmulke or not. They were no longer going to remain in the playoffs. They lost. But the issue still stayed in court. So the archives are full of fascinating sources. The one I'll share with you is by Norman Krupnik, again, a Jew. Who was he? He is a referee, a longtime official referee of 33 years for the basketball at the high school athletic organization, IHSA. He reports this, he submits his affidavit, and if you look at number 4, during all my years as a referee and assignment chairman, I have never witnessed an injury caused by a yarmulke worn during a basketball game, nor by a bobby pins or clips used to attach the yarmulkes to the players' heads. So just like all of us, he too, a referee of 33 years, he testifies that I have never seen an injury, a dislocated elbow, a sprain, anything like that, because of flying debris of yarmulkes. But more than whether about the issue itself in basketball, I want to understand what are the arguments given. So another testimony was given by Rabbi Oscar Fassman. A picture of him is on your left. And this is reported routinely in the local press. The issue of whether Orthodox Jewish basketball players. This is February 81, so this is 3 months after the teams had lost in the playoffs. This case is still continuing. Rabbi Fassman explained that the skull caps, known as yarmulkes, are a symbol of reverence that must be worn by Orthodox Jews. The Orthodox Jew at all times acknowledges that he bears the yoke of the Almighty. The skull cap is that declaration of being servants unto the Lord, he said. What do you make of Rabbi Fassman's testimony? What's he doing here? That's not in Shulchan Aruch. That's not even in the more lenient Ramah.
Yeah, but I think it just reflects how the world has moved, really, so that it becomes, I think, as you described earlier, a point of identity. So it's much less of a religious question than a cultural question, isn't it? And cultural symbols can be quite powerful and quite important. I suspect that's where he's coming from, but I'm sure he realizes that it's not a halachic issue.
And he's not offering that, but he is testifying to the newly assigned meaningfulness of the yarmulke in Anglo-Jewish life. I'm safe if I say it Anglo-Jewish life, making it more relevant and Atlantic. Absolutely, I agree with you. Judge Shiur, here you have a picture of him. Even before he offered his ruling later on, the Illinois High School Association asked him to recuse himself from the decision because he was a Jew. And he was terribly upset, and maybe it even influenced his view, perhaps, in favor of Yeshiva and Academy. How dare you suspect that I, as a Jew, am going to rule only in favor of them? I'll have you know is that I hold no official Jewish position, so on and so forth. It turned out, though, that I think that Judge Shiur's babysitter, he didn't know it at the time because she had changed her name, was in fact Shalom Menorah's mother long before. So he had a connection. He just didn't realize it at the time. But in any case, it's an amazing document, an amazing, incredible text, is that Judge Shiur rules in a court of law with the following rationale about sport. Any prohibition on yeshivas and academies' ability to participate in Illinois High School Association interscholastic basketball would have a material negative impact on the school and upon their students generally, both apart from and in addition to the negative impact on members of plaintiff class, plaintiff being Academy Yeshiva. Playing of interscholastic basketball by Yeshiva and Academy represents to the community at large, Jews and non-Jews alike, that those schools are real schools. You heard it. You're not a school unless you play ball. That participate in the mainstream of American life, culture, and participation in that culture was hugely important. So he might have said the same thing about watching The Empire Strikes Back. You have to be able to see that, or else you're not really American. Such interscholastic play gives the schools and their student body a sense of normality, self-worth, and achievement, and provides a special outlet for the students' physical and mental needs. That is the value of sport. And how dare, without proper evidence, that the High School Association prevent Jews from playing ball? It's a First Amendment issue. IHSA's Robinson confirmed that, in fact, they said as much, that the loss of the opportunity to participate in interscholastic activity would represent a great loss to the students. But here we have Richard Posner of the Appeals Court. So I'm not familiar with the judicial system in England, but I imagine it's quite similar. Is that you have different tiers of the courts. So if you didn't like the ruling for the federal and the lowest level courts, then you can go to the appeals court. And if they decide whether or not to take the issue or not, and they can reverse those decisions, and ultimately it comes down to whether or not the Supreme Court would like to take the issue. So Richard Posner, another Jew, overturned Shader's decision. Ordinarily, this is already in 1982. So we are more than a year, we're almost a year past when the team suffered their defeats in the playoffs when the issue actually came out. Ordinarily, yarmulke just perches, on the head. The bobby pins are an acknowledgement of the yarmulke's instability on a bobbing head. So very Talmudic, but not at all Talmudic, is that Justice Posner says, well, wait a second. Why do you, if the yarmulke doesn't fall off, then why do you guys wear clips? Why do you wear bobby pins? Yarmulkes fastened by them fall off in the heat of play with some frequency. It's true, they do fall, but they don't necessarily hurt people. While we are not Talmudic scholars, we are reasonably confident that the plaintiff's counsel acknowledged at oral argument that the precise nature of the head covering and the method by which it is kept on the head are not specified by Jewish law. There's no Shulchan Aruch for a kippah clip. You can wear whatever you want. We put the burden of proposing an alternative, more secure method of covering the head on the plaintiffs rather than on the defendants, because the plaintiffs know so much more about Jewish law. So get out of here, says Justice Posner. The basketball organizers, they don't have any expertise in yarmulkes. It's on you. In fact, this was his method. The Wall Street Journal published an article in 1984 on, and actually cited this case, about Posner, who was from this University of Chicago school that had this economics, not economics in terms of monetary, but supply and demand, and who wears the burden of proof. And it didn't matter if you were the defendant or the plaintiff to Justice Posner, still alive, and I think a member of the court today. Shader passed away quite recently, about 2 years ago. But Posner was of the opinion, a unique one, and there have been several articles and books, a whole book written about him by Oxford University Press, no less, that it didn't matter who was serving as plaintiff or defendant, who was actually being sued. It was up to whoever could best determine the outcome of the case. In this case, it was the experts in Jewish law and yarmulkes and everything else Jewish, the issue in the academy. And so he ruled, did Justice Posner, that even though we've never had a recorded injury due to yarmulke, no fractured fibula, because of an errant falling yarmulke, nevertheless, it is up to the Jews and the Jewish schools to determine how to stabilize them on the young athletes' heads. And here you have the example in the Wall Street Journal article where this case is cited explicitly. I should also say here that that there are two other cases of yarmulkes that have to do with in judicial texts that have to do with the Air Force, actually. And for Jewish chaplains, for the right to wear a yarmulke rather than a beret or a part of their uniform. And in both cases, it was decided in the case of military, it is important to have uniformity and collective grouping, and therefore that trumped, because it was the military, any other argued religious exemption. So this is the most well-known case that isn't to do with military. So Sylvia Neal, just to end our story, to round it out, Sylvia Neal gives indication that, in fact, the students led by Shalom and Ora were persistent even after Justice Posner, to their chagrin, overturned Shader. They wanted the Supreme Court to take that issue, but you need to have a super minority, it's called, of the of Supreme Court justices take up the case, and they didn't get 3. I think it's 3 that you need, and they only received 2 votes. Upon the Supreme Court's denial of our petition, writes the lawyers for the yeshiva and the academy, we discussed the possibilities of alternate types of head coverings, including those alluded to by Judge Posner in his opinion, meaning you guys figure it out. You both strongly expressed your beliefs that the boys on your basketball teams could not be forced to wear bizarre head coverings. You can only imagine the contraptions that were being devised while playing basketball, because requiring such attire may be in conflict with Jewish law. I don't exactly understand what that means. Indeed, you said that you would rather, in all likelihood, pool your teams from the IHSA, and it's important only one private school in all of Illinois was not a member of IHSA. To what Shader had said about sports and basketball in America, it's also point out that the Bulls were horrible. This is before Michael Jordan. Remember, Michael Jordan was a high draft pick, was 3rd pick in the NBA draft, testifying the fact that the Chicago Bulls were absolutely miserable at basketball. So I don't know if there's a correlation between the 90s Bulls and this, but this precedes. This is a basketball story in Chicago that precedes Jordan and Pippen. You said that you would rather, in all likelihood, pull your teams from IHSA if such hardware was required. The only alternative acceptable to you that we discussed was securing the yarmulkes with Israeli clips. So what are Israeli clips? So that's these. Should have brought a bobby pin as well. But these are contour kippah clips. Don't know if we do a poll of which ones we prefer. But in fact, during the proceedings with Justice Posner, they hired a consultant to the yeshiva and the academy, a physicist, to determine what was the best adhesive, what was the best tool to maintain the yarmulke, fastening it to a head. So Dr. T. Willis, on April 18th, 1983, so now we're in 83. Remember, the basketball, the original restraining order was issued in 1981. So this is going on for 2 years. I have completed a series of tests on the yarmulke retaining clips and have been provided to me. And based upon these tests, I have determined that the contour clip, the so-called Israeli clip, appears to be a superior fastening device to the simple bobby pin for the purposes of holding a yarmulke to the head. A brief outline of the test protocol and results is shown below. And here I've given you just one of his tables. But you see that he was pretty extensive. He used a bobby pin on the hair without a yarmulke. So he had his control group. He had his contour clip, that's the Israeli clip, with no yarmulke. He had a silk yarmulke, a wool yarmulke, contour clip, and bobby pin. So he did great testing. And he measured the force that it would take to remove a yarmulke from an athlete or any, I guess, I don't know if he also looked at greasy hair, non-greased hair. I don't think he did long hair. It was after the hippie period. So I don't know if he did that. So, and here you have Rabbi Eisenberg and Rabbi Tzvi Blanchard, yeshiva on top, academy on the bottom. And she gives you, this is the court case we taught. This was the letter that we just read about. So about the Israeli clip, and here are the players involved. And finally, in June 83, the Chicago Sun-Times reports, a federal judge signed an order. This goes back to Shader after Posner went back down to Shader's court. A federal judge signed an order Tuesday enabling students at Edecon Academy and the Hebrew Theological College Preparatory School to wear yarmulkes while playing interscholastic basketball. A peshara They agreed on a compromise. In the order signed by U.S. District Judge Milton I. Shader requires the players to secure the yarmulke with Israeli clips, the clips which will be sewn in the yarmulkes. So it's not just it's freestanding, but it's the top, I imagine, is embedded in. And you had the top was woven into the yarmulke, and they would clip. There are such yarmulkes. They're not so popular, but they have built-in clips. But that was the agreement they made. This is being recorded, so I won't comment on what the current practices of the Yeshiva basketball team. The order culminates a 2-year legal battle that began in 1981 when the Illinois High School Association, IHSA, which regulates interscholastic athletics, prohibited Orthodox Jewish basketball players from wearing yarmulkes during play. And you see all the different Jewish and civil liberties organizations that got involved. So what's at the core of this history? What's happening here? What's happening between basketball, what's happening with Jewish identity, and American culture at this time?
A synthesis between the two.
A synthesis.
Well, a willingness to synthesize the two, and a want to do that.
I would say not even a willingness or a want, but a compulsion, almost a summoning to do it. Where in fact the arguments made in favor of the yarmulke had much to do with American culture. And sports is not a silly thing. You see that a very serious person, a federal judge no less, was willing to put in writing in his decision, in the thought processes of his conclusion, that playing sport and wearing a yarmulke have to be wedded together. That in a free modern society, you have to be able to wear both. Without that, it wasn't fair. And in a democratic society, wearing a yarmulke, displaying your Jewish identity while doing something authentically American, authentically meaning what is determined to make sense, was deeply important. It was no small thing. Just take a look at some of the lawyer fees that were exhausting in the cases in the American Jewish Historical Society.
But it's not so cut and dry, because actually, if this had not been a basketball team but been a wrestling team, wrestling in America as well, there's no question at all they wouldn't have allowed the kippah this is not you can express yourself wherever you want. This happened to be a sport where it was easy to accommodate. But there are many sports.
That's true. No, that's true. And there probably would have been evidence of injury had they done. My brothers, I'm not a very big person, but my brothers were wrestlers, and they wrestled bareheaded. Nobody, I think, wanted to wear a yarmulke because you could hurt somebody. And you're right. Part of the challenge for the defendant was that nobody had ever heard of an injury caused by yarmulke. But so there was the possibility of mollifying all concerns based on the fact that basketball did not pose a serious injury. Nobody accused the Illinois High School Association of being anti-Semitic, of course, but the looming thought of safety, but also the ability to rectify that was important. So I agree that it was a doable thing. And because it was doable, it was also sensible. And I think that's also part of it. Okay. So thanks so much for helping me tell this story.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Eleff. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Could ask a quick question? Over time since then, has this been sort of a common refrain where Jews didn't have access to certain things and over time have built it through the court system?
Yes.
Or have people just become a bit more accommodating by themselves?
No. It happens usually with scheduling postseason competition on Shabbos. So in Houston, this was the case when they got further along into the playoffs. Like schedule, some faith groups don't want to play on their holy day, which is Sunday. So you have that. so many games are scheduled on Saturday. There was actually, he's no longer very popular now, but in the Bill Cosby show in 71 or 72, before the Cosby show, Bill Cosby show, he wasn't a doctor, like he wasn't a long-standing show, but he was, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, was the Cosby show. He was a YMCA ball coach. He was a basketball coach and a baseball coach. And there was a Hasidic boy who didn't really fit into American society, but he was a great cleanup hitter. He was great at whacking a baseball. And he had to decide if he was going to play on a Saturday, and Bill Cosby convinced him not to. But sure, even in model government and model United Nations, there was a case in Boston. My Maimonides school sued for the right to be able to compete in the national level in Atlanta that year. This was only probably 10, 15 years ago, to compete on a different day other than Shabbos. So it still looms large. And the ability to participate, regardless of religious restriction, is deeply important.
Thank you.
Right.
Really enjoyed. I just want to say I really enjoyed. Much appreciated.
Great. All right.
Thank you so much for that. It was very interesting, fascinating.
My absolute pleasure. Anytime, really.
Yeah,
I did
it was
this.
great.
I gave a talk in Australia. The time works much, much better for England.
Rabbi Eleff, I've had the pleasure, I use that word with some quotes, of playing a lot of basketball with Ida Crown graduates, and being able to connect the dots to this story is pretty amazing. So thank you so much for sharing it.
Great.
I went to Brandeis in the 90s, which was pretty big. Ida Crown was a pretty big feeder school. So
I went to Brandeis as a grad student much later, but great. Terrific. All right. Take care, everybody. And I know that you're further along. Don't tell me what the news is. I'll figure it out myself, and usually it's ominous. All right. Take care, everybody.
Cheers. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you very much.